Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian. I wanted to make a separate video all about how I make patch pockets because I will be adding this one to a skirt this week. And thus, we begin over on the blue patterning table of doom to draw some very simple shapes today. No doom involved at all today. I'm going to start by using my 2-inch ruler, tracing down either side to create a 2-inch channel for the center of my patch pocket today. Either side of that, I'm going to draw an additional 2-inch channel. This is going to end up being a 1-inch pleat on either side of the center. And then I will draw 3 inches on either side for the full width of my pocket. Now, of course, you can make your pocket any shape or size with a pleat, without one, whatever you would like to do, but I was trying to replicate this pocket off an Alexander McQueen skirt. I've added seam allowance on either side as well, but when deciding the full height of my pocket, it's almost easier to see what this will look like once the 2 pleated sections are pleated down, so you can see the actual width of the finished pocket, which I have drawn on the other side here. So this is what my pocket looks like if the center pleats are pleated down and out of the way, so I can get an idea of how tall I want this to be. I couldn't decide if I wanted it to be square or rectangular, but in the end I did decide that with an 8-inch wide pocket, I wanted to have an 8-inch tall pocket as well. And I will extend this a little bit by putting the pocket flap a little bit higher. Basically, you can adjust this a tiny bit later on using the height of the pocket flap. So if you don't get this right on, 1/2 inch here or there won't matter because of the pocket flap on top. So I'll add my seam allowance to the bottom, square that off, and then measure up 8 inches here. I was still thinking, do I want to make this 8.5? No, let's just make it 8 inches tall here. Finish off this rectangle for the main body of my pocket. Now you can cut a lining and actually fully face this, which is what I will do for the flap. So you will see that process as well. But for the main body of my pocket here, I'm just going to add a 2-inch fold under facing to the top of this. So my pocket is 8 inches tall, plus the 1/2 inch of seam allowance, and this 2 inches of additional fold back at the top. And I will cut that out, and I can show you what it looks like once the pleats down the center are folded in. It'll look like this. That fold back along the top makes it look like this. I'll fold my seam allowance under, and we can get an idea of what this pocket will look like. And of course, you can start making adjustments now if you would like to. And let me cut my flap down to fit here. This flap is 3 inches tall and that same 8 inches wide, but I actually want to make this a little bit wider. So instead of just adding on the 1/2 inch of seam allowance on this side, I'm going to add in 5/8 seam allowance. Just that extra 1/8 means this is a tiny bit longer than the underpiece, just so that this flap up here is as wide, if not a tiny bit wider than the pocket below. So this is 3 inches with the seam allowance on either side, comes to 4, so 4 inches tall, and then this piece is 9 inches wide because again 8 plus that additional inch, technically 9 1/8, but you know what I mean. And I'm just going to fold this in half and then draw in the curve that I want for the bottom shaping of this pocket flap so that it will be similar to the McQueen skirt pocket that I was using as a reference for this project. So I'll cut that out, again, fold in my seam allowance, get a look at what this is going to look like when it's finished. And I decided that I wanted this curve to be a little bit lower on here, so I just am going to add 1/2 inch of seam allowance to the bottom of this so that it finishes exactly where it's at right here. Made the center a tiny bit pointier, add seam allowance onto this, cut this out. Once again, you could make this straight across. You could make this one big convex or concave curve. You could have this, dagged in the other direction. You can make it geometric, scalloped, whatever you would like for the shape of your pocket flap. As the same, you could make a circular pocket if you wanted to, and then have a square pocket flap. You can get really creative with the shapes of these things. The thing about a patch pocket is it's a patch, just with a hole in the top. So it really is just like a piece of applique. You can do almost any shape as long as you leave a hole for your hand. It counts as a pocket, which you also don't need to have a pocket flap at the top of your pocket if you don't want to. And you also can cut this all in one long shape so that the rectangle is long enough that if you sew it halfway, the flap will just flap down. Hopefully you understand what I mean by that. And again, I'm just doing one very specific style of patch pocket today. There are as many different pockets out there as there are designs floating in your head, and you can choose any pocket you may like. I don't often use pockets myself. In fact, I only ever use them for style reasons because when it comes to storing things on my person, I love a handbag. Now, like I said, I will be lining the flap of my pocket today, if not the main body of it. So I'll cut this out of my cotton twill that I'm using to make the skirt, and then also out of a cotton voile that I have sitting nearby, just another lightweight cotton. Just because it's easier to line these little pointed curvy sections than it is to turn them under 1/2 inch like I will with the rest of the pocket. So I'll line those two pieces up here, right sides together, of course. The twill has a right side at least, if the wall doesn't. And I will leave a little opening along the straight edge of the top of this flap here so that I can turn this right side out in the end. Now, if you're less familiar with sewing little tight corners and stuff, I always like to mark exactly where I need to turn the needle on these just so I don't get turned around and everything comes out as crisp as I would like. And I just did that with a colored pencil, but of course you could use tailor's chalk as well, which I have picked up a chip of here to mark where I need to put my pleats on the main body of my pocket here, which does look ginormous. This is rather a large pocket, but even more so because of these pleats. I'll just go ahead and pinch my pleats into place, these 1-inch pleats down the center of my pocket, leaving a 2-inch wide, like box pleat, I guess, in the center of my pocket. There might be terms for these parts of pockets. Not that I know of. I'm winging it, you know. I didn't research how to do pockets. This is just how I would do it when given, you know, free reign here in the sewing room, which is sometimes successful, sometimes not. Now, I was looking at a couple of different Alexander McQueen skirts as inspiration for the project I was working on, and this wool version of the same skirt as the leather one I was also referencing has just one line of top stitching to secure the patch pocket down to the skirt underneath, but it does also have top stitching along these pleats. So I'm going to pin each of these pleats into place and do a 1/4-inch top stitching along the lines of the pleats. Hopefully that makes sense when you were looking at that pocket, because it doesn't make much sense to me now that I'm saying it aloud, unfortunately. I have my pocket flap here under the needle, again starting along the top flat edge of this, leaving myself a gap up there, and sewing around the corners and curves, leaving the needle down in the interior point of my points, picking up the presser foot, swiveling around as need be, and I am doing some careful back stitches right at those points as well, just to make sure they are very secure when I go to clip those corners later. Then I will turn my stitch length up to 8 stitches per inch, just a longer stitch length rather, for doing my top stitching along my pleats in the main body of my pocket. I will then clip all of my corners, which on this piece I have quite a few, and clip my curves on here as well, and turn this right side out because of course everything is kind of bag lined at this point for my pocket flap. And then yes, turn that right side out. I'm using a knitting needle here to help me poke out my corners. Do be careful when doing this though. If you're too violent, you will poke right through the fabric and then you will be really bummed. Sometimes it's just move the threads aside if it's a loosely woven fabric and you can kind of zhuzh it back together. But this is a closely woven fabric, both of these, so I do need to be careful not to stab right through the points. You know, with pressure, but not too much, honestly. And I'll just press that into place and we have a nice little pocket. Now the top stitching, when I stitch this onto the garment later, will catch the opening I had left in the long straight edge in the top. So I'll just forget about that for now. Once this is pressed, it's the like seam allowance for that, it's kind of pressed into place. You could hand stitch it shut if you wanted to, but it's going to get caught in the top stitching later, so I'm not worried about it. I will, however, just pin the lining and the fashion fabric together so they don't move around on me when I do the top stitching around the rest of the pocket flap. And I'll just give my pocket pleats another good pressing here from both the back and the front again, making sure they behave. Again, you can fully line this just the same way I did for the pocket flap if you would like to. Make sure the edges are completely finished. Again, mine are going to be folded under and the seam allowance will be caught when I attach this down, patch it onto the garment later, so I'm not worried about it. I do need to fold down my 2-inch sort of facing for the top of my pocket here. You can make this smaller. It just kind of flaps around then though, so unless you are going to stitch it down, I recommend having a deeper facing like this along the top edge of the pocket. Not that I, again, intend to use this pocket much, but that's all right. And because this edge will be left raw in here, I did go ahead and serge it so that it wouldn't be completely raw. And then I will start folding my pocket together. So I'm going to fold my 1/2 inch of seam allowance along the side here, and I'll fold the very top of that at 45 degrees to create a little corner up there that again will get caught in my top stitching and be held down so that it's nice and clean. Do the same for the other side. Fold down my little corner like so, and pin it into place so that nothing moves around on me much while I do the rest of this. Then I will fold up the 1/2 inch seam allowance along the bottom of my pocket. And then for these bottom corners, I'm actually going to completely fold them out and down and then in on themselves. Hopefully you can kind of see what I mean here. I know this is black fabric. A lot of this footage is actually kind of noisy because I have turned the exposure up quite a lot so you can see what I'm doing in the black fabric. No one is surprised that I'm using black to make a garment. Let's face it, most of my closet is black at this point. At least half of it is shiny, you know? if not more than half of it. But here's the general shape of my pocket coming together here, and the flap of course will come up here, but actually the McQueen pockets I was referencing do have the corners tucked up and in just a little bit down here as well, as you can see in this image if you're looking very closely. So I'm going to tuck my corners up, even though they were quite clean to begin with. Now they're going to be even cleaner once this is stitched down, although it will be a little bit thick in my cotton twill here, which is the same as like a denim. This isn't as heavy as a denim would be, but still the same sort of weave and kind of edging towards a denim texture. So not the thinnest fabric in the world, but with a little ironing, we'll make it behave. Some help from the tailor's clapper here as well as my hands. Mostly using my hands. It's cold down here in the basement, so don't worry about me burning myself. Often enough, it's actually how I'm keeping warm. And again, the pocket I was directly referencing just had one line of top stitching around here. You can actually do 2 lines of top stitching, which is how the leather McQueen skirt was done. And you can actually slip stitch the edges of this down onto a project as well for a more invisible finish. But I'm going to find the area on my skirt where I want this to be. I actually tried the skirt on and held the pocket up and kind of decided exactly where I wanted this, which was 4 1/4 inches down from the waistband. So I'm going to go ahead and position this into place and pin along the edges here, hoping all that ironing work stays in place as I do, which some of it does and some of it doesn't. But at this point, I'm just patching my pocket onto the garment itself. Now, you would want to do this when the garment is not a garment. I mean, if you're adding on a pocket to something that is already finished, fair enough, which is kind of what I'm doing here. But if you are sewing a project from scratch, do your pockets first before the rest of the thing is sewn together. My side seams, the skirt is all finished here, which is kind of irritating for sewing the pocket on. Better to do it when everything is flat, of course. But I made this project over 2 days, and on day 1 I did not have enough bandwidth for making the pocket for some reason, so I did it last. That's just how it worked out because of my brain, not because it was actually the most efficient or like best way to do it. Sometimes things happen not because it's best practice, but because it was the only practice I could see following through with, which is kind of what happened here. But back to my pocket flap, I'm going to top stitch the sides and bottom edge of this and not the top edge. I'll leave the top untop stitched for now because that top stitching will occur when I stitch this down onto the garment. But everywhere else can get its top stitching. Again, I'm using an 8 stitches per inch, a larger stitch length for that. And then down here, I will use that same 8 stitches per inch and a little bit of back stitching at the top here to stitch around the edge of my pocket. Again, keeping my needle a 1/4 inch away from the folded edge here, so it's catching the seam allowance on the inside here, holding that finished edge down while stitching it to the garment below cleanly. And again, you can see all the turning and fussing that I have to do because this garment is finished, as opposed to just sewing this on when something is flat, which is much, much easier. But as usual, past me, she's doing her best. Like so. Okay, so the main body of my pocket is on. I just need to position my flap into place, and I wanted the top of my pocket flap to be 3 1/4 inches down from my waistband, so I'm just going to mark that, which happens to be an 1 1/4 up from my pocket itself here. I'll just pin this into place, and I will top stitch along the edge of my pocket flap here to both hold it closed and hold it down onto the garment itself. And you can see I do have my tailor's ham inside the skirt here to help me position this. Again, much easier to do on a flat thing, I'll say for the 100th time. But it is still perfectly possible to add a patch pocket onto a finished garment. And I'll go ahead and stitch that down. Just a little tiny last bit of stitching on the corner here to connect my top stitching from earlier to this top stitching. And we're good to go. And here is my finished McQueen-inspired patch pocket on the side of my pencil skirt here, and the rest of this particular skirt making adventure will be coming in a separate video shortly, and if you do happen to be watching from the future, I'll have it linked in a card and also on the end screen. And thank you as always for watching today. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!